Hey there, this is Julia from Grad Skills Pro. Today, this is going to be the fourth video in the series of 6 videos, and I'm going to tell you how to write a scientific paper with the ideas framework. Today, we're going to talk about the express part of the ideas framework, which is basically the meat of the paper. In this video, we're first going to recap the ideas framework very briefly. Then we're going to learn how to use your data to create a storyline of your paper. Then we're going to learn how to make publication quality figures. And then we're going to talk about how to write the results and discussion sections, the abstract, and the conclusion. So a quick recap of what the ideas framework really is and what it stands for. The I stands for imagine. So this is where we're going to think about journals and things like that before we even start writing. The second part, the D, stands for draft and document, which is where we're going to draft the method section and the introduction and start documenting what we did. E stands for establish the storyline and express the details in there. A stands for adjust, which is basically where we are going to edit the paper and where we're going to finalize it. And then S stands for submit. Using this ideas framework is really a great way to beat writer's block and to be able to write a paper in a fraction of the time than you would normally do. So I've been using this framework to write and publish my own papers for the last 17 plus years. I did not like to write papers at the very beginning. It was a really painful process. And now I really love doing this, and I can do this in a matter of weeks. My first paper took about 18 months to write and 18 iterations. It was really not fun. And so I've actually learned something in the process. My second paper took 2 weeks to write, only had minor edits, and actually received a Best Paper Award. And so I've taught many grad students and undergrads and postdocs over the years to write and publish their own papers, to use this framework to do that. And I'd love to teach that too, which is why I'm making these videos. It's also because I love talking about this stuff and seeing students actually having fun writing and also seeing them publishing amazing papers. So if you want to learn more about how to write and publish a paper, check out the links in the description for a bunch of free resources that we have. So let's talk about the data and the storyline. How do you create a storyline from the piece of data that you have? And so what's the best strategy for this? What I've found is really to pick the most important or most interesting pieces of data. So pick about 3 to 6 pieces of data, depending on how long of a story you want to make it. And also what is really important. What are the most important pieces of data that you want to show? This depends also a little bit on the journal, the article type, and really the storyline that you want to tell. And everything else that is not like crucial can actually go into the supplement. So then look at your data and make sure that data is bulletproof. If you have a whole bunch of outliers that you cannot explain, dig into this, figure out why they happen. I'm not saying take out the outliers, but you need to be able to explain them. And because basically what you want to make sure is that you only show data that you can explain, and you don't actually ruin your reputation by publishing bad data. So once you understand your data, sometimes what I do is I just like print out all figures and tables and just like lay them out on the floor and then basically pick the pieces that make up the storyline. And so what you want to do then when you have all of that, you want to order your figures and tables into a storyline. So really take those 3 to 6 pieces of data, order them so that they make the most sense in terms of telling a story. And really each main point of the paper should be highlighted in a figure and a section. So when you order those figures or tables, typically what works really well is to show the most important figures or tables first, because when the reader reads the paper, sometimes they might not get to figure 5, but it also depends. Sometimes if that doesn't make the story flow, then just keep it in order to really have either order of complexity or chronologically to tell a great story. So then when you have those pieces of data, then the question is, how are you actually going to make publication quality figures? And so I want to share some tips with you how to do that. So first of all, decide on the color scheme early on before you make any of those figures. Because usually what happens if you don't think about this, if you don't plan this ahead, is that you make a figure and you have 3 colors in there, and you make figure 2 and you have 5 colors in there, but they're completely different than the first figure that you made. And then you have another figure, and it basically your colors and color schemes are all over the place. They wouldn't correlate with the type of data that you want to show. And that is really confusing to the reader. So if you decide on a color scheme early on and actually stick to the same color scheme for all of your figures, it's much easier for your reader to understand what the color scheme stands for. Oh, blue is always for that type of data that you're showing in each of your figures, for instance, or red is another type of data, is always for the baseline, or I don't know, something like that. And it helps really the reader to understand what you're trying to tell them. Also, I highly recommend to choose grayscale figures if you can, because there's actually color figure charges that the journals charge. But also keep in mind that if you need color to actually tell a good story in the figure, and if using color helps the figure, then do that. Then try to avoid the red-green combination for colorblind people. This is something I highly recommend. There's a lot of people who are colorblind, and if you show them red-green, they cannot distinguish between the two, and you still want them to understand your figure. Then I highly recommend to avoid stark contrasts unless it helps the figure. So sometimes this can be like really jarring if you have like black and white, but if it does help the figure in some way, then keep it in there. And then you want to ask yourself some questions like, are all axes labeled correctly? Do you have any shadows that you can possibly avoid? Really keep things simple and don't make it overly complex or fancy. Usually when you try to make it fancy, this is when your figure will start to look cluttered. Keep the font sizes the same as much as possible. And also if you have subfigures that you're basically assembling after the fact into a larger figure, so when you resize the subfigures, make sure that all font sizes are still legible and that you don't just have like tiny fonts that you can't really read anymore. So when you have a figure, I recommend like in your final figure that you have assembled, print it out on a piece of paper and see whether you can still read it. If you cannot read it anymore, then that's a good indication that you have to change your font sizes. And then also avoid visual clutter. Ask yourself, what can you take out? What are the most crucial pieces that you want to show? And what pieces can you take out? And also in particular, if you take specific pieces out, can the reader still understand the gist of the paper? If the answer is yes, then that piece of information is not crucial and you can take it out. So before we talk about the results and discussion section, if you like this type of content and want to get notified when the next video in the series comes out, go hit the subscribe button and also comment below what you're struggling with most when writing a paper. That way I can answer your questions in the next videos. So let's talk about the results and discussion. So you have your 3 to 6 pieces of data. You have made them publication quality. So these are your figures or tables. And what you then do is you order them, or you have already ordered them into a storyline. And then what you're going to do in your results section, you're going to create a subheading for each of the figures, which will then become its own section. And what that does is people who are really busy and who don't have time to read your whole paper, they can follow the storyline by looking at the figures. On the other hand, the text corresponds to the figures and actually tells the same story. And so after you created these subheadings, you basically fill in the sections like to follow along the storyline. So now we're going to talk about the abstract. And while a lot of people are writing the abstract very much at the beginning, I highly recommend you not doing so and actually write the abstract after you've written results and discussion, after you've basically written your entire paper. And the reason is this. So first of all, the abstract is the second biggest selling point of your paper after the title. And you need to understand that the abstract is not just a summary of the paper, but the abstract is therefore to draw the reader in. And it's also much easier to write like the abstract and the conclusion at this point because you already know what the storyline is, you already know what the gist of the paper is, what are the most crucial pieces of data that you want to highlight. I write my abstracts by following the rule of 3 because the human brain can very easily hold 3 pieces of information. And so really you need to ask yourself, what are the 3 most crucial pieces of information that you want the reader to walk away with? And these points of information are actually what you're going to be talking about in your abstract. And lastly, you're going to have the conclusion. So I usually write the conclusion from the inside out. So that's a method that I'm actually talking about in the Zero-To-Published program. And so the conclusion is really answering the question, what specifically have you accomplished? So describe the main findings, give an outlook, what still needs to be done, connect it back to the big picture and the storyline of the paper, but also answer the question, how does the research that you're describing in that paper make the world a better place? How does this fit into the body of research that's already out there? And so this really connects things back to a big picture. If you want me to teach you how to write and submit your paper in a lot more detail, you can join us in the Zero-To-Published program. There's a link in the description below, and I would hope to see you there. Thank you so much for watching, and in my next video, which will be part 5 of the series, I'm going to be going into a lot more detail into the adjust part of the ideas framework, the part where we're going to edit and finalize your paper for submission.